US Press. I welcome you all to this webinar. My name is Martin Stavenga. I'm the publisher of the journal Environmental Policy and Law. We're very grateful to function as a platform for this discussion. Bharat, the editor-in-chief, Bharat Desai, the editor-in-chief, mentioned this wonderful subject, the human rights to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment, to set up this webinar as a discussion moment, to form a platform for ideas, to share the views. And we're just very grateful to enable that as a publisher and for the journal. We'll spend about maybe 1.5 hours. Bharat asked me if I could take the humble task of timekeeper, which I gladly will do. Each presenter will have about, say, 7 minutes. We have a challenging task of having everybody to present their views in such a short time, which of course could take much more, but I think we will manage. Looking forward to a fantastic discussion today. With that said, I'll gladly hand over to Bharat. Bharat, to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Martin. Yeah. Good morning, good afternoon to all the distinguished panelists. It's indeed a pleasure and a privilege for me to invite you and to host you on this very, I would say, the honest occasion when a historic landmark development which has taken place, which everyone was waiting for a long period of time, to have an explicit kind of a emphatic global recognition of the human right to clean, hygienic, and sustainable environment. And that did come. One step was taken last year on 8th of October 2021 when the subsidiary organ of the United Nations General Assembly, the Human Rights Council, adopted a resolution. And that was followed up, on 28th of July by the parent organ, the political organ of United Nations. The General Assembly adopting a resolution entitled, by the same title on 28th of July. Now it's my great pleasure and honor to introduce our distinguished panelists first, and then I'll briefly provide little setting, and then we will open the presentations or the talk by our panelists. Let me first start with Professor Nicholas Robinson. He's one of the eminent scholars, university professor at the Hobbs Law School at Pace University, and he's also executive governor of the International Council for Environmental Law. Then we are honored to have Dr. Karan Singh, the former Maharaja of Jammu and Kashmir, former Union Cabinet Minister and Member of Parliament of India for 5 decades. He was the member of the Indian delegation to Stockholm in 1972, along with the then Prime Minister Indira Gandhi. We are honored to have you, sir, here on this occasion. Then we have other panelists, Gudmundur Eriksson, a former member of the International Law Commission, judge of the International Tribunal for Law of the Sea from Iceland, and he's currently professor at the Jindal Law School. And then we have very distinguished scholar, Professor Kurt Junker, professor at University of Cologne in Germany. Then Professor Jonas Ebbesen, professor at the Center for Environmental Law and Policy at Stockholm University in Sweden. Then Professor Owen McIntyre, professor at University College Cork, Ireland. Then Richard McCrory, one of the one of the pioneering environmental chair holder and at Imperial College Science and Technology in UK. Then he retired as an emeritus professor at University College London in UK. Then we have Philip Cullet, who is again a very active scholar and lawyer at professor at School of Oriental and African Studies at University of London in UK. And we have Professor Dr. Shailesh Nayak, eminent scientist and one of the decision makers at the Ministry of Earth Sciences, in New Delhi, and currently director of the National Institute of Advanced Studies in Bangalore. We have Victor Tafur, adjunct professor at Pace University Law School, USA, and IUCN's representative to United Nations in New York. And finally, we have Victoria Lichette, again very distinguished executive director of the Global Pact for the Environment in France, and currently she is based in USA. And some of the panelists have been very active, and they have contributed a couple of our contributions, chapters to our book which we came out with. on 3rd of June 2022, the volume called Envisioning Our Environmental Future, published by iOS Press. Now, let me briefly provide little setting, and then we will kickstart the discussion with Professor Nicholas Robinson. Now, as I mentioned, this is basically we have been waiting for. There was already a recognition by 2 international covenants on civil and political rights, and the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. We were waiting for explicit, emphatic recognition of environmental human rights, and that took a quite long time. And remarkably, as I mentioned, that the first initiative came as a part of the large process which the Human Rights Council of the United Nations has been doing as a subsidiary body of the General Assembly, and it came out on 8th of October 2021. And now it's very interesting that we decided to time this our webinar on 28th of September. This is the today. This coming week will be very high level segment or at the 77th session of the United Nations General Assembly, where heads of state, heads of government will assemble. And it seems this is the week when almost they say all roads lead to New York, all road leads to United Nations, where all the country delegations they want to come and speak, where the General Assembly of the United Nations will provide a platform, the 193 member assembly. Now, very interestingly, I must mention at the outset, and I'm sure other distinguished panelists will set the tone of discussion, that both the resolution which I mentioned, the Human Rights Council resolution and the General Assembly resolution, the operative paragraphs of both the resolutions are verbatim identical. They exactly use the same language, and probably what the subsidiary organ did, the General Assembly as a political master, could not have basically deviated from that particular text. And what we will try to probe are 3 important I would say the issues and areas. One is to explain probably the context and the significance of celebrating the UN General Assemblies and the Human Rights Council's emphatic recognition of the human right to clean, healthy, and sustainable environment for the Sustainable Development Goals 2030, as well as other rights and existing international law. Second, normative value of the General Assembly's resolutions for universality of the environmental human rights and impact of the human right to the environment on treaty-based international environmental obligations and observation of human rights of individuals and inanimate objects, as well as domestic policies, legislations, and litigation. So there is a broad kind of a range of issues, which these operative paragraphs of the General Assembly resolution have been speaking about. So what we plan to do is that we'll have a brainstorming, a very little louder thinking by our distinguished panel, and this we will follow it up, as I said, by extending invitation to our various distinguished speakers and other contributors, to have a special issue of the environmental policy and law, and volume 53 in 2023. And I already sent out invitation some, and rest I will follow. So I think without much ado, we'll kickstart the discussion, and I'll request Professor Nicholas Robinson to make his presentation. Over to you, Nick.
Thank you very much, Bharat, and thanks to iOS and Environmental Policy and Law for sponsoring this webinar. And greetings to all my colleagues. I'm privileged to set the stage. Bharat asked me to give an overview of the decision to have the right to the environment be recognized. It's come 50 years after we did recognize the right to the environment in the Stockholm Declaration, and that declaration really assumed people had the right to the environment, much like the Philippine Supreme Court did 30 years ago in the case of Oposa versus Factoran, where Justice Hilario Davide found the right to the environment in the Constitution of the Philippines as a right rather than in the Bill of Rights, but as a assumed right, a platform, a foundational right, a norm on which all government and all society exists, because it is the human instinct to survive, the human instinct to want to keep thriving. And the adoption last summer in UN General Assembly Resolution A/76/300 recognized a right. It didn't create a right. The right was there all along. And I think our discussion today really has to be an examination of what is the content of that right and how can it be applied. There are at least 4 tracks of international law and policy and indeed ethics, which combine together in this debate. The first is long before both Stockholm and after Stockholm, but long before last summer's General Assembly and the brilliant work of Costa Rica in preparing for the adoption of the resolution. We had a tremendous body of law and normative thinking in different states and governments. So the right to the environment has been in the Indian society for a long, long time before the law accepted it and embraced it. And it exists in the civilizations, I would say, of many countries. So these national trends are parallel, but they are a confluence. They feed into their streams that feed into the international river that this right to the environment consists of. Then we have the work that was going on in the UN Environment Program, created by the Stockholm Conference. And last February and March, we had the program in Nairobi, UNEP +50, and we had the meeting of the United Nations Environment Assembly. And this is an entire outgrowth of thinking and policy making and articulation of rights. One of the most important elements of the UN Environment Assembly has been articulating the environmental rule of law and building environmental concepts into concepts like due process of law and equal protection of the law. A third category is that which we've had more intensely, which was sponsored by the Club des Juristes in France and the government of France to promote a global pact for the environment. And this induced a tremendous outflowing of thinking and support for codifying the rights to the environment and giving them a clear definition and focus. And that is still an ongoing debate. It flowed into the UN Environment Assembly at the 50th anniversary of UNEP, but it hasn't ended there. And it was a parallel and robust debate to the 4th category, which came out of the human rights debates. 20 years ago, the human rights community did not wish to accept the human right to the environment. There was a sense that if we tried to introduce a human right to the environment, we would weaken all other human rights. It would somehow compete with them. Well, that language and that rhetoric no longer is heard. We've now had a complete transformation of that rhetoric, and the human right to the environment is now embraced as the foundational right for all human rights, because without life and human life, what is left of the question of the debate on human rights in any of their other incarnations. So these 4 great rivers have flowed together now into one, and we have to make sense of it and how in reverse we draw strength from those sources. And so I think our debate today, Bharat, and I'll close with this point, is really to ask, what is the content of the right to the environment? What does it mean? What should it mean? And more importantly, perhaps, how do we make it operational? How will it be observed? How will it change conduct? Conduct both of states, conduct of states towards individuals, because human rights are held by individuals, but also conduct toward other species, conduct toward nature. What is its relationship to the rights of nature? And this operationalization of it can be very practical. For instance, we have in all nations the duty to undertake environmental impact assessment. And EIA is a customary international law when it comes to transboundary EIA or the commons. But it also exists as a duty under all but about 5 nations have adopted a national ordinance or statute law for environmental impact assessment. How does the right to the environment bring power to that assessment and move it from being peripheral and technocratic examination into being an examination that addresses the fundamental stability and sustainability of our civilization? So I'm looking forward very much to the comments of all the panelists on this, and that is the broad context in which you've assembled us. So thank you very much, Bharat.
Thank you, Nick. For spelling out some broad contours of this human right to recognition of human right to environment, and that is exactly what the content of this right and how does one operationalize. That is exactly the task which will lie ahead of us, and I think probably we will need to spell it. I'm sure the other panelists will probably put a finger on it and then try to give their own view. Now let me request Dr. Karan Singh. As he has a distinguished kind of a role. He was a chairman of the Indian Board of Wildlife, and he has played remarkable role so far as the many of those environment initiatives are concerned, taking up many of the issues. And since he has just contributed a remarkable contribution on looking through Indira Gandhi's vision after 50 years of the Stockholm Conference. So over to you, Dr. Karan Singh.
Editor of this excellent volume, my good friend Dr. Bharat Desai, very distinguished presenters, who are all highly academically involved. I'm perhaps the only one coming from a political background. My academics have been some other field, the political science, but it's a great pleasure and a privilege to be on this panel. Warm greetings to all of you from India. I was 41 when I went to Stockholm. I'm 91 now. And in these 50 years, I've actually seen the whole transformation that are happening, negative and positive. Now, Stockholm 1972 was indeed a historic event because it was the first time that the United Nations took cognizance of the human environment. And I remember a sense of excitement when we all gathered in Stockholm. There were delegations from many countries, Turkey, and there were only 2 heads of government, Indira Gandhi and Orange Party. And I think it's a very tragic irony. Both of them were assassinated when they were in office. But the point I'd like to make about Orange Party and Indira Gandhi is the importance of a political commitment to the environment. Technocracy is all very fine, bureaucracy is all very fine. Unless there is a strong political commitment by the top politician, it's not going to work. Because politics really, whether we like it or not, is the driving force for a great deal of what happens in the world. And on a highly sensitive subject like the environment, I think politically in his introductory remarks, he mentioned civilizational values. I think that's something which we reiterated there in Stockholm also. The Indic civilizational values involve a reverence for life. For example, in our Atharva Veda 4,000 to 5,000 years ago, a remarkable hymn of 62 verses called the Hymn to the Earth, and that has the most extraordinary statement of environmental values. There's just one quote which I'd like to make from it. Whatever we dig from the earth, may that have quick growth again. Earth, may we not injure thy vitals or thy heart. Now, this is something that has come down to us for ages. Unfortunately, that is exactly what we have done. We've injured the vitals and the heart of the earth, and much of Western civilization has been based on the curious belief that we are born to exercise sovereignty over all other living creatures. Now, that's not so in the we are part of it. We've grown from unicellular organisms 2 billion years ago to where we are. We've also grown with it. We're therefore part of it. And we cannot take upon ourselves the hubris to say that no, we are sovereign over all of it. I think that has really created a lot of the havoc that we see. I've been fascinated by James Lovelock's Gaia theory, of course. I met him and spoke with him in one of our international conferences. And the concept of the earth is a living being. This is the earth that has nurtured us from the primal cells to where we are today. And if we misuse the earth, search the earth, it is going to be bad. And I'm afraid that's what we are now seeing. In the 50 years since Stockholm won, my impression, and I'm not sure whether statistics bear this out or not, my impression is that the situation has in fact sharply deteriorated. I've just seen Earth's editorial in this latest issue, where it's become very clear Stockholm 2 was a very low-key affair. There doesn't seem to be any of the excitement that there was in Stockholm 1. And no clear guidance has also emerged. No leaders have stepped forth and said, okay, we will take responsibility and head this. There's been a lot of distinguished people there. I must say what the Secretary General Antonio Guterres said, Earth's natural systems cannot keep up with our demand. We haven't kept our promises on the environment. That is the big thing. We have not kept our promises. We made promises, not kept. If we go on like that, sooner or later, he said, he asked, Indira Gandhi or Olive Palmer were here today, what excuses would we offer up for our inadequate action? The obvious answer they would tell us that further inaction. And so we have to now be very clear in our minds that we've got to step up our performance. Because when we look at what is happening, it is quite horrific. The climate change is already upon us, the floods, the tornadoes, the hurricanes, the melting of the glaciers, the rising of the sea. Many countries are going to disappear. Let me make one point. We're going to have to face environmental refugees. In years to come, there are going to be millions of environmental refugees who are going to flee from their countries because they are unable to support. And so now we've got to really work very hard. And I'd like to add one other thing. And that is that when you talk about healthy and sustainable human right environment, please remember the word healthy. Unless we have healthy human beings, we're not going to have a healthy environment. Healthy environment assumes healthy human beings. And I'm afraid the recent COVID pandemic has shown how miserably ineffective our health systems are, even in so-called advanced countries. Like the United States, I mean, over 1 million people have died. And Europe, all the systems have collapsed. That is happening in the so-called developed country, then what can we say about the developing countries, which for centuries were exploited by the colonial? And so we've got to concentrate also on health, because malnutrition is also a scourge that is creating havoc around it. We've got to make this the top priority, and we've got to raise public awareness to that. And that, I think, follows our educational system. As we introduce environmental values into our educational system, we are not going to have people growing up with the awareness. This is something desperate. I love the way those children shout at us and say, "Get us down." You know, those young children were shouting that, "Well, you're going to let us down again." And the problem was going to happen. So I think my time is over. So I will simply end by saying that we've got to step up our activities. When we're not doing well enough, we've got to do better. Our politicians have got to be much more alert and active than they are now. And of course, our academics, people like you, are doing marvelous work. No, I congratulate all of you on the panel, because you are all people who are working actively for decades in this. But we have to do better. Or what we've done our best. I'm sorry, our best. So, as they say, fellow presenters and environmentalists, we better get cracking. May the force be with you.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you. Yeah. So nice of you. I think, yeah, you made a very great. I think that is exactly what when Nick flagged, at the outset, the contours of it, how does one operationalize this, recognition of the human right to environment, and Dr. Currency put his finger on precisely on that part, that is those who are the decision maker. In fact, Environmental Policy and Law Journal is, it is our one of the, our second running title is the Journal for the Decision Maker. So the question is, who are the decision makers? And basically, they are the politicians. And Dr. Currency, with that long innings in politics, he knows it better, that by drawing comparison between 72 and 2022, that when you are in command, that we expected somebody to be there, somebody to bail the cat, come forward and give a big push to that. So we will need to scholars will need to sensitize the decision maker, especially the politicians, and because otherwise operationalization will take a long time. And second important part, which again Dr. Currency made, is that when it speaks about the healthy, you need that human being is part of nature, and unless the human being is healthy, from all dimensions, environment cannot be healthy, and I think that is exactly what probably in the post-COVID era we will need to give greater attention to health, human health, especially from all dimensions, your moral health, your environmental health, So thank you very much for this input. Now it seems Gunbunder Eriksson is not around. Martin, is it there? Okay. So in that case, I will turn to Kirk Junker, over to you, Kirk.
Thank you very much, Bharat. And I'm happy to have heard the comments of Mr. Singh, because I'm going to further those comments, I believe, with what I want to present, as well as to address Nick's call for how we operationalize this. Let me start by telling you, because Mr. Singh also reminded us of what Antonio Guterres has said just last week in his press conference. He said the following: "I have just returned from Pakistan, where I looked through a window into the future, a future of permanent and ubiquitous climate chaos on an unimaginable scale, devastating loss of life, enormous human suffering, and massive damage to infrastructure and livelihoods." And now comes the important sentence: "What is happening in Pakistan demonstrates the sheer inadequacy of the global response to the climate crisis and the betrayal and injustice at the heart of it. Whether it's Pakistan, the Horn of Africa, the Sahel, small islands, or least developed countries, the world's most vulnerable, that did nothing to cause this crisis, are paying a horrific price for decades of intransigence by big emitters. G20 countries are responsible for 80% of emissions. If 1/3 of G20 countries was underwater today, as it could be tomorrow, perhaps they would find it easier to agree on drastic cuts to emissions. So in the context of what General Secretary Guterres has said, and when we talk about what does it mean to have had this resolution, unfortunately, I'm going to go in two different directions, but I'm tending more in the direction of that which was said by John Knox, the former UN Special Rapporteur for Human Rights and the Environment. He noted on the resolution, he said, by itself, I'm quoting him, it will change no policies, enact no new laws, save no forests, stop no pollution, but it can be a powerful catalyst. Now, if we go back to Mr. Singh's comments, is this being a powerful catalyst adequate? If we go back to what General Secretary Guterres said, is this going to be adequate to address the things he has identified? And this is where I become negative on it. I think the answer, in fact, is no. So I don't want to be a wet towel on our discussion today, but maybe this will provoke further discussion. What I would say, and I'll build on what Nick Robinson has volunteered today as well, is that we do know how to operationalize rights when rights can be concretely recognized in litigation. And maybe now I'm going to show my stripes as having been a common law trial lawyer for 10 years. And I'm going to say, if we're going to operationalize, we have to operationalize not through legislation, but through litigation. We have had in just the past 2 years internationally, the following traction through litigation, and it acts much faster than further legislation acts. In the United States, for instance, in the plastics industry, the Earth Island Institute was successful against Coca-Cola, Pepsi, Nestle USA, and Procter & Gamble on its use of plastics through citizen action against these companies. In 2021, in citizen action against emitters in another state's forum, not in their own forum, Okapabi versus Shell, the Nigerians took their action in the UK rather than taking it in Nigeria, because we know about the Ogoni communities. 1970 took their action. It took 50 years to get the judgment. I don't think we can wait 50 years on that. And the UK Supreme Court held that Shell had a duty to the Nigerians. This is an extension, therefore, of extraterritorial rights that the Nigerians were successful in doing through citizen litigation, not legislation. An additional category, citizens taking an action against their own state. This has begun to become successful as well. We all know about the famous, Martin is joining us from the Netherlands, the Urgenda Foundation. The Urgenda Foundation successfully took its action against the Netherlands. Nobody believed it would get traction. The state appealed. It appealed a second time, and only when it got all the way to the Dutch Supreme Court was it in fact found that yes, the Netherlands had failed to carry out its requirements under the UNFCCC's requirements for taking immediate action to address what Antonio Guterres tells us needs to be addressed. And I'm sitting in Wiesbaden, Germany. Just last year, the case was brought before the Federal Constitutional Court of Germany, and the Federal Constitutional Court of Germany, in a decision in March, held that a carbon budget needs to be established by the state, and the failure to have done so was a failure by the state of Germany to have carried out the requirements that it's required to do under its commitments for international law. The final category returns us then to the resolution that the United Nations has just passed. Citizens versus their own state, not in their home forum or in another state forum, but in an international forum, the European Court of Human Rights. Duarte Agostinho and others have taken an action against Portugal and 32 other states. There's been a standing issue for some of these plaintiffs so far, but the litigation has not been defeated yet. And in a case that is near and dear to my heart in Switzerland, a group called the Verein für Klimasenioren and Seniorinnen, these were people who were denied individual standing as being uninjured, the locus standi problem. So they formed a Verein, they formed an organization and took their action before the European Court of Human Rights against Switzerland, for failure to have taken the action that Switzerland needs to do to protect their rights as well. So I'll conclude my remarks by saying that if we're going to operationalize, as Professor Robinson has suggested we need to do, and we need to do it now, as General Secretary Guterres has said, and as Mr. Singh has reminded us, then I would suggest that litigation is the way to do this such that we can act quickly enough, because further legislation, I don't think is going to operationalize things fast enough. Thanks very much for the opportunity, Bharat.
Yeah, thank you very much, Kurt, for this, trying to spell out, what will it take, to operationalize, the entire effort, to realize the human right to environment. And this is one of the pathways, and Kurt, is very fond of it, and he has just contributed a very thoughtful chapter, to our curated book called A Question of Trust, a reparative legal regime for climate-induced migration, And I think there is still this growing body of those who believe that, well, since the UNFCCC, the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, the regime itself is probably stagnating, although it is proliferating, but it has become a bottomless barrel. The question is, how does one, since the climate emergency, as the Secretary himself said, it is one of the catastrophes. So how does one bring about a result? And there are that could be way out, where national legal systems could be approached, to whether you can hold the governments responsible, can they be accountable? These are the questions which lie in the womb of the future. We'll see how the different legal systems will respond to it. Thank you, Kurt, for this, flagging
Very
this
welcome.
issue.
Thank you.
Now, let me turn to the colleague, Jonas Ebbesen, from Center for Environmental Law and Policy at Stockholm University. Jonas had just organized a very very thought-provoking 3 days conference at his center in the Stockholm University, which I missed. I couldn't go. I spoke virtually, but this was exactly the Stockholm plus 50. How does one take the process forward in terms of the legal response in other thing? So over to you, Jonas.
Thank you very much, Bharat, for inviting me to this webinar, also for inviting me to contribute to the book, and congrats for its publication. So I will essentially give a short presentation of what I wrote in that one. And what I did was to explore how the notion of a human right related to the environment has been advanced between Stockholm 1972 and 2022. And I used the road metaphor, since that was part of the overarching project. I should say, I think it appears to be very male panel that we are speaking here, but I'm sure that the organizer has done what they could to have it a bit more balanced, but it struck me when I was looking. Anyway, so what I did, I looked first at what the Stockholm Declaration sets out, and in some cases, in some respects, the declaration was quite silent of issues in a surprising way, for instance, on environment and security, which was really a key element at the time. But it was also forward-looking in other respects, and not least with respect to human rights and the environment. And both Principle 1 and the preamble of the Stockholm Declaration sets out this in ways that are not so far from what we see today. But it would take quite a bit of time, and now 50 years, until we have had this confirmation by the UN General Assembly. So what I tried to do was to look, okay, what are the different steps? And my first part was what happened between Stockholm and the Rio Conference. And of course, at the Stockholm Conference, the existing human rights treaties did not mention the environment. They had been adopted in the 1950s and 60s. And at that time, the very concept of the environment had not yet really been developed. So it's not so surprising, contrary then to the 1988 African Charter on Human and People's Rights, which indeed has this specific reference to the environment. And also, which I think is somewhat forgotten, the 1988 San Salvador Protocol to the American Convention on Human Rights with respect to economic, social, and cultural rights. It also sets out a rather bold provision. And I think it was not really until the 2017 advisory opinion of the American Court of Human Rights, but this was really used in a way also to interpret the convention. So until the Rio Conference, there was some advancement, and the Rio Conference and the Rio Declaration was a bit ambivalent. On the one side, it did not really confirm the rights approach taken in the Stockholm Declaration. It had a bit of a softer language. Apparently, some countries were concerned that the right approach could also be used in national context. On the other hand, the Rio Declaration sets out in Principle 10 what has been a key element for the development of the human right to the environment with respect to the procedural dimension. And here too, at this time in 1990s, I think this provision in Principle 10 and also some geopolitical changes with the fall of the Berlin Wall made it possible to develop the procedural dimensions of the human rights and the right to the environment that had not been possible before. I think if we would have asked anyone in 1972 about the possibility for international treaties in the same vein as the Aarhus Convention or the Escazú Agreement, they would have laughed at you and said that this is not in international law, this is the domaine réservé for national countries. It is about governance, it is about secrecy, etc., etc. So outside the scope of human rights, there was very little at the time. But issues that had previously been national now was able to address at the international level. And the Aarhus Convention was a result of the Rio Conference very much. The negotiations started soon after. There were also some bold provisions in the NAFTA side agreement adopted soon after the Rio Conference, sometimes also which tended to be forgotten. And last but not least, in the 1990s, we started to see the development of a bold jurisprudence on human rights and the environment. In the European Convention, we saw it in the African Charter, and we will see it in the American Convention, despite the fact that it was only in the African Charter where there was indeed reference to the environment. So another important point on this procedural dimension is that in the global environmental agreements adopted before the Rio Conference, there was no mentioning about public participation or public awareness. But in all environmental agreements of global scope adopted at or since the Rio Conference, there are provisions not setting out a right, but supportive to public participation, which is very important, not least for those parts of the world where we don't see any human rights jurisprudence of courts or any treaties like the Aarhus or Escazú treaties. So I move ahead. After the Rio Conference, there have been a lot of developments. One very important point for international law and policy is, of course, the Sustainable Development Goals. And although there are references to human rights in the Agenda 2030, the Sustainable Development Goals, which are goals rather than entitlements, they are not defined by human rights language. However, I want to also, in addition to the book that Bharat has edited, I want to promote a recently published book by me and Ellen Hay on the Sustainable Development Goals and international law, where we examine, with the help of colleagues who have looked at each and every Sustainable Development Goal in relation to international law, we conclude that for each and every goal, the human rights institutions of international law are very important for the implementation. And we also notice that the SDGs and the Agenda 2030 define sustainable development in a way which differs quite significantly from before. And we argue that it is built on a cosmopolitan understanding where the situation of each individual matters. And this, of course, is also something which could be linked to a human rights approach. Finally, I should move ahead. I see time is running to where we are now. And the UN Human Rights Council resolution, which was confirmed at the Stockholm +50 meeting, and even more importantly, confirmed by the United Nations General Assembly resolution, confirms now that on this bumpy road, after 50 years, there seems now to be a broad recognition that this is a right. And I'm quite surprised that not more states, I should say, tried to block the adoption of the resolution. I think there is a potential in it in different ways. It can push governments to take action. It can make governments to avoid action, and not least, another change since 1972 is that there is now a rather strong recognition of the human rights dimension on corporate activities, which was not the case in the 1970s. Then it was only focused on activities by states. But we see in the Dutch Shell case, which is still pending, that is actually very much built on human rights law on corporations also. I have a few points for the future. I agree that litigation is important, but I don't think there is one single way ahead. I think litigation without development of legal frameworks, international and national, will not take us very far. So I think we will need to see this reflected both in litigation, but also in legislation that implements this at the national and international level. I stop there, Bharat. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Jonas, for this beautifully covering, the compass, so far as the entire trajectory of the evolution of the human right to environment. Because in fact, Jonas has contributed a very thought-provoking chapter to our edited book, on advances of human rights and the environment. And since the book was under print, actually, when it was already under print on 28th of July, when the development took place, Jonas wanted to add a postscript to the chapter, and by that time it was too late. Probably we'll include it, when the new volume it will be designed. But I think what the issue which Jonas has flagged, and since he has been one of the co-chairs of the Aarhus Convention on public participation, so that is very point is very well taken in terms of public participation. The question also remains, and that as we saw at the Stockholm 50 also, that we saw that we have huge amount of those multilateral environmental agreements. There has been too many. There is literally a treaty congestion. Too many treaties have been designed, for instance, over the last 50 years or so. Piles of those documents and things. Question is, how does one translate them into action? And I think so. Probably the time has come for the scholars and others to think, can we little go beyond the legalese, the technical legalese, and I think how does one bring about the public participation? Can it be that kind of a people's movement? So there could be various ways in which these things could be facilitated, because realization of the right, though, and as if we include, human being as a part of nature, how does one transpose that into at the domestic level, and that will be probably one of the biggest challenge, which I think everybody will need to a little give a thought to it. Yes, Jonas.
Yes, sorry, I just wanted to add one very important element in that, since you mentioned the Aarhus Convention and SKSU agreement, is the increasing attention given to protecting those who use these rights. There is a provision that had been used quite strongly and boldly against Belarus in the Aarhus Convention, but there is an even bolder provision in the SKSU agreement on the importance of protecting human rights defenders in environmental matters, or environmental defenders, or simply members of the public when exercising these rights without fear for being harassed, persecuted, penalized, or even killed. And I think this is something we will see more of, and it's of course supported by the General Assembly resolution.
Yeah, thank you, Jonas. Okay, now we'll move to our distinguished colleague and scholar Richard McCrory, and I think we'll connect this to what the previous discussion which had. Question is, how does one transpose those international environmental obligations at the domestic level? And Richard have been a connoisseur of this entire process, especially with reference to the European Union. In fact, he's one of the pioneers. Like, as I remember, when there were no other chairs on environmental law, it was Richard who held this chair, at Imperial College on science and technology. So he has a long trajectory, and he has been a member of the Royal Commission on Environmental Pollution, and he's still currently a member of the UK's highest level, the decision making. So when we want to sensitize the decision makers, I think probably Richard can spell out that what it takes, what are those things which will really matter. Over to you, Richard.
No, you're too complimentary. I have to say I'm here as much in a learning process, because I remember a few years ago when this move for creating a right to a human environment, a healthy environment, was being proposed, and I was asked to join. And I have to say, maybe it's partly because I'm very British, and I'm maybe an academic, but I'm also a very practical lawyer as well. I want to see policy. I was a bit suspicious. Is this really just symbolic reassurance, or is it going to get anywhere? What's going to be the effect? And I still wonder, precisely what it does mean. And one of my issues, does a right, and perhaps Nick or somebody could tell me, does a right to a healthy environment, does it mean basically I have a right to freedom of air pollution, water pollution, so on, so I can live healthily. But does it also mean that I have a right to see bits of the environment, I mean, the endangered species or whatever it is, which may have no impact on my health, but I think it has an impact on the health of the earth, if you like. Does it include that? I'm not sure. The right to a healthy environment, does it include that? Or will this actually hasten the debate about giving rights to natural beings such as water or trees or whatever, which again, I have a lot of issues with, but we could do that. But I don't know whether this will hasten this debate. But I suppose one of the things from the British perspective, and I'm also not an international lawyer really, so as you say, EU national, is that, we did introduce some years ago, Human Rights Act based on the European Convention, and watching those very broad principles having an effect within the national system has been very interesting, and I could see this happening. And one of the ways you were talking about operationalizing it is to say that in every piece of proposed new legislation, whether it's an act of parliament or regulations, whatever area it is, the relevant minister has to make a declaration that in his view or her view, this bill is in compliance with the Human Rights Act. So I could see something like that where one says that, because at least, it's not foolproof, but it engages the relevant government departments. And I think it's particularly non-environmental departments in thinking we're proposing new rules, regulations. How do they affect these rights to a healthy environment, whatever that means? And we have to make a statement. And it's a kind of political accountability. And we've got a system again here. I mean, it's this balance, as you know, the British, at the end of the day, we feel our parliament is sovereign. And so the courts are, will not overrule acts of parliament as such. But they can make a declaration that they feel that a particular legislation actually is not in compliance with human rights. And that becomes a kind of, it doesn't invalidate the law, but it makes it very political, that suddenly you've got a court declaring that and Parliament will look again. So I think there may be provisions down there one could look at. And the other thing I just sort of throw out, which, I'm just experiencing at the moment, as you know, we left the EU a few years ago, so we're sort of working through what that means. And one of the interesting things about the EU is, as Jonas and other people know, it does have this internal mechanism for the European Commission supervising member states. Are they complying with their obligations? And it's a very, very interesting sort of supranational thing. They can go to court. And when we left the EU, people began to raise, including myself, well, what are we going to do now? Who's going to supervise government? Who is going to ensure that public bodies comply? And initially, we said, well, maybe we need something like the Commission, some sort of independent body. And initially, the response of government was, no, you don't need that, because if we fail in our duties, and I'm applying this now to the health environment, we're politically accountable to Parliament, and NGOs can take us to court and test their luck there. And our argument was, well, yes, NGOs can still do that. You allow for actions, but that's not the same as a systematic body looking at all the law, looking at everything. And in fact, there was a change of Secretary of State, and the new one got it. And there has been just set up, it's only in the last year, this body called the Office for Environmental Protection, which is quite small. I'm on the board, and our role is basically to monitor government and all public bodies, not the private sector, because that's regulated, to say, are they complying with their environmental duties? We can monitor environmental law, and we can start investigations, and eventually we can take them to court. Now, we hope, just as the European Commission, most of its cases, it manages to sit round with the government or whatever and settle them and negotiate. And we hope that we'll be able to do that, because the trouble with actions by citizens, they're very good in some ways, but they're not very amenable to actually getting to practical solutions as such before you get to the courts. So this is and there isn't quite, there are various bodies like this around the world, but nothing quite like this new Office for Environmental Protection, the range of powers and so on. We're very small, it's only about 50 people, so we've got to be very selective in the cases, but we're just starting. So I sort of throw that out, thinking about the enforcement, because I don't think, as we heard, citizen suits, enforcement NGOs can be very, very important, but they don't cover everything. They don't necessarily deal with everything. And I do think there is a case for, at a national levels, some form of independent scrutiny. I mean, nothing's completely independent, but you can be as independent as you can be. So that's what I sort of throw out, some operational ideas.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Thank you, Richard, for spelling out this. Both UK's predicament. Both being part of the EU and post EU phase. How UK is trying its best to try to have a system, and the Office of the Environment is a remarkable initiative by the government. And the question is, how does
it's quite, and just one other thing to pick up, from what Jonas was saying about Aarhus. One of the really interesting things about Aarhus Convention, I don't think any other convention has it, is this citizen complaint procedure that anybody can write. We've replicated this at the OEP, and it's a bit like the Commission. We operate a citizen complaint system, so anybody, if you're going to have official bodies as well, or the ordinary citizen needs some way of getting that their concerns examined. They won't always be right, but anyway, I throw that one in. Sorry.
Okay. So I think so. I think different national systems will try to work out, and I think this is exactly where the catch will lie, both in terms of the international environmental obligations, both the hard law as well as the soft law, because that works. I think many of the governments have been comfortable with the Stockholm Declaration, which is a soft law, non-legally binding. But most of the like, for instance, the legislations which are enacted, they invoke the mandate from the soft law rather than that treaty law, because that provides a political convenience to the states. So we need to literally balance between the the kind of the many of the governments, and then they have their own compulsions, they have the developmental pressures and those things. So question is, how does one navigate and in terms of try to balance those interests of developmental and environmental pressures, so that those international environmental obligations could be transposed at the domestic level. There are ways in which, like, UK had its own mechanism to have the Office of the Environment Protection to do that, like and Kirk was mentioning about the litigation method, for instance. There are some countries having the very robust civil society groups which have been, but provided the governments allow them, provided the judicial systems facilitate, like India has had a very remarkable trajectory of the public interest environmental litigation, for instance, like even Philippines said, So I think whether the systems will allow that thing to allow that environmental right to be given effect to, and that covers a wide range of those issues. Now, as a continuation of this, let me now bring in Shailesh Nayak. Dr. Shailesh Nayak, he has been a scientist, and he had the privilege of being for a very long period as a secretary of Ministry of Earth Sciences, and he has been dabbling in many of these policy making, decision making processes, probably. So we can take his view, and he has also contributed a chapter on how climate change and wetlands interface could be basically sorted out from the policy perspective. So over to you, Shailesh bhai.
Thank you very much, Bharat bhai, and I'm extremely grateful to all previous speakers, and especially Professor Nicholson and Dr. Karan Singh, to provide a great learning in this very nice, with very distinguished praise, august praise of the very distinguished speakers. I think the points which are made, I fully agree, and if you see the overall, the human life as such depends on the various goods, services provided by various ecosystem. And if that is not in healthy, I think the livelihood itself becomes the issue. And this point which was made by Professor Nicholson about environmental impact assessment, I think this is one of the great instrument which has now, we try to understand that how the environment likely to be affected by our own activities. And I think if you take the example of the climate change, which is happening of our various activities in last 200 years, which has dramatically changed many aspects. It was mentioned about the Pakistan floods, but it's not only floods, it's floods, droughts, cyclones, heat waves, cold waves. All this is happening in a variety of the different places. And but if you see this impact of the changes on the society, I think the time has come where we also need to address the social impact of the changing environment. And I think these aspect is also extremely critical. The impact of this, whatever happening on different communities, different societies, is not uniform. Though if you take an example of a cyclone, it may not be the same impact on the society, what happens in US or what happens in India or what happens in Philippines. The reason behind this is that the knowledge which we have about the various environment and the system is not exactly translated everywhere uniformly. And if you see in the world today, there is an inequality in knowledge, in technology, in these income, in the living standards, all at this inequality. I'm not trying to say that we need to measure this inequality, but we need to understand this inequality and try to see that how this we can understand for providing the social impact on this. And the other thing which is a very important part is that one is the knowledge about the climate change, its impact on different ecosystem, on different people. But at the same time, we also need to integrate with this knowledge a social system. And Dr. Karan Singh mentioned about the political will or decision but at the same time, the governance system, if you see throughout the globe, is not equal. It's also unequal in different ways. So the political system, the governance system, also at the same time, the industrial and the other infrastructure which you have tremendous impact when you want to try to translate the rights for on the environmental rights or the human rights as we have been defining. So we need to integrate both this thing, but still I think the picture is not complete. Because even if you have the knowledge and even if you have the appropriate social system, we have seen that the human system, that means the consciousness of the communities, if they are not aware about their rights or about what is happening around, both this system together also fails. So I think we need to find ways and means to integrate all these three systems, because at this model which we need would be quite different in different places. And we need to take recognition of the local culture, local sensitivities, local requirement of the livelihood, and integrate with this our knowledge which we have, and need to have the appropriate governance system to put it into practice. I think this is in my view, which will be very essential for us to move forward in this direction. And I think the 50 years back, we recognize the value of environment, but today I think we also recognize the value of the livelihood. And I think we need to find ways and means to marry both the livelihood as well as the environment. I think then only we would be able to provide the rights to people about the clean and sustainable environment. Thank you very much for this opportunity.
Thank you, Shailesh bhai, for bringing this very from a very practitioner's point of view. The dimension of the livelihoods. The how and the people who matter, whose lives could be affected. And as you can see, how the Secretary General's anguish and the concern, coming out, from his visit to Pakistan and many other areas where sudden cloudburst or abnormal weather events or floods, cyclones, those events, then how does one cope up with these kinds of things, and we are yet to have that very effective, robust system which can really mitigate the pain of the people, to reach out to them. And the question is whether the people for whom you really want, how does it reach out? Are they aware, and the poverty, inequality, those factors which Dr. Nayak has really brought in, and that brings a different dimension as to can we have a one single measuring criteria, when you have a transposition of the international environmental obligation into domestic level, for instance, different countries, different systems, because there are communities, whose level of that, developmental trajectory is different. And I think that sensitivity will need to be there. Those who are policymakers, those who are decision makers, shall have to factor those in. Otherwise, I think most of the things which we are talking about will not reach, because that the trajectory itself will be there will be a huge gap, in terms of the what is promised and what is actually. And I think that exactly is required. Hopefully, we thought that, well, at the high level segment of the United Nations General Assembly, during this week, probably some wise people, some those thought leaders will simply be there at the General Assembly to really guide the pathway, to provide about that. The Secretary General has been very concerned about in fact, the outgoing President of the UN General Assembly, Abdullah Shahid, had also said that, well, although there is no room for despondency or cynicism, negativism, like his entire plank of his presidency was presidency of hope. You saw the 2 years of the COVID-19 pandemic, that really brought in a lot of that kind of a practical, kind of a dimension to this entire dilemma, human dilemma, or we call it the problematic, global problematic, which we are really talking about. Now, let me now, bring in, a colleague, Owen McIntyre, professor at University College Ireland, and Owen has contributed a chapter to our curated book on convergence between international environmental and natural resources law. In fact, he has great expertise on international water resources law, and a lot of that dimension, and water as one of the important components so far as the future challenge is concerned. Probably that maybe Owen will be able to put a finger on that point. Over to you, Owen.
Thank you, Bharat. Thank you. It's a great honor to be invited to join this distinguished panel, and a great pleasure to see so many old friends, if only virtually and online. I'm not going to talk about water today, Bharat. I want to talk about the potential role of transnational environmental rules and standards in the realization of the human right to health. I want to, in so doing, I want to follow on the presentation of Nick Robinson about the question of operationalizing this human right, and regarding the choice of over legislation or vice versa. I think that transnational environmental regulation offers a complementary means of promoting realization of the human right to environment. As pointed out by a number of speakers, particularly Professor Ebbison, the Resolution 76-300, this is a culmination of a decades-long project or campaign, 50 years if we trace it back to Stockholm. We've seen, incremental steps under conventions. For example, the Article 24 of the African Charter on Human and People's Rights, Article 11 of the San Salvador Additional Protocol to the American Human Rights. We have the interpretation, if you like, of Article 8 of the European Convention on Human Rights. Of course, the 20 years under the framing of the Escazú Conventions. We've seen concerted efforts by UN human rights bodies, its independent expert and special rapporteur, the work of the Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, Office of the High Commissioner of Human Rights, UNEP, UNDP, etc., all trying to provide normative guidance to states in the implementation and realization of a right to environment. Landmark judicial decisions of domestic, as was pointed out, a number of national courts have fleshed out to some degree what this right might be. Landmark international decisions, the advisory opinion of the Inter-American Court of Human Rights, for example, from 2017 or 2018. But, you know, while some normative has been provided, you know, we must remember that there really is required a very, very extensive range of substantive and procedural rules and standards for effective realization of such a complex and wide-ranging human right. The implications of a human right to a healthy environment range across every sector, range across such a range of activities that, you know, litigation would take a very, very long time to adequately elaborate what's necessary under this right. Legislation, it would need to be, you know, very, very, very extensive, more extensive investment in legislation than we're likely to see in the vast majority. So if we fall back to what we have in transnational global environmental law, that might prove helpful. You know, we have this very rich existing range of relevant human rights compatible environmental standards developed in a variety of, you know, an extensive formal and informal, substantive and procedural environmental standards developed by a diverse global, regional, state and transnational range of actors and coalitions, more often coalitions of such actors. These would include things like certification and labeling schemes for various products and processes. Think of the Forestry Stewardship Council, the Aquaculture Stewardship Council, the Alliance for Water Stewardship Alliance, Marine Stewardship Council, etc., etc. You know, all under the auspices of the ISEAL Alliance, which of course provides guidance on, you know, with its credibility principles and code of practice. Consider the safeguard policies of multilateral development banks and then increasingly private sector project finance lenders under the Equator principles, which tend to, you know, stipulate rules on pollution and climate mitigation, biodiversity mitigation, environmental, public participation, etc. There's a range of intergovernmental organization reference standards. Consider the World Health Organization drinking water quality standards, the OECD for the classification of chemicals. And of course, the emerging practice under the SDGs, as was mentioned earlier, you know, the practice in respect of the targets, the indicators, in respect of monitoring and reporting thereunder. And of course, a whole raft of technical rules and standards developed under multilateral environmental agreements, under, you know, CBD, Montreal Protocol, etc. So I would suggest that this wealth of standards and rules provides or can play a sort of symbiotic role with the more formal legal measures required for realization of a human right to environment. The Declaration of a Human Right to Environment, I would expect, will very rapidly influence this broad range of global governance standards because, of course, they undergo periodic review, the vast majority of these systems. So they will take account of human rights standards very, very quickly and easily. And then de facto governance standards that apply will inevitably inform more formal legislative and judicial decision-making. Scholars like Daniel Esty have mapped and tracked that. The transnational environmental law, you know, in combination with formal systems, improves responsiveness, flexibility, and accessibility of a legal order of one sort or another for the realization of human rights. The environmental law standards gaps and lacunae to address deficiencies in formal legal frameworks. Deficiencies largely due to the globalized nature of commercial activity. You take the example of the Roundtable on Sustainable Palm Oil, which has had a significant effect on illegal forest clearing in West Kalimantan, for example, for the palm oil industry, in a way that many formal systems simply couldn't touch that sector. The governance provides for indirect application of informal standards, and has this impact of being able to sort of impact environment beyond the reach of formal and again, the example of the RSPO and of multilateral development banks in respect to the palm oil industry. So just, that these systems and are often supplemented by the SDG, the example of SDG 6 on water and sanity, I think attests to that. And all development incorporates strict standards of administrative governance, of legality, proportionality, fairness, rationality, transparency, participation, review, accountability, etc., and very often expressly provide for respect for human rights. I just would finish with a quote from Professor Laurence Boisson de Chauzer in Geneva when looking at the role of transnational environmental law in respect of broader environment, but I think it's equally true in respect of a human right to environment, where she said that all normative means are used to this end. And I would suggest that's very true here. We need the full range of legal and quasi to promote of a broad, extensive human right to environment. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you, Owen. Yeah, some parts of your talk were a little not audible, but probably if we made a little sense. So I think what you have flagged, the transnational environmental standards, and again the question which will be very important if one can really you refer to the Yale the Dynasties group's work, something, and I think they did come out recently with the environmental performance index, and I think since we speak about the human right to environment, sustainable environment, for instance, probably we'll also need to rely upon the performance or the parameters where the states and different measuring criteria, that what will be that package, with the help of which we will measure where does a particular nation state stands, so far as those things which are implemented at the domestic level are concerned, like air, water pollution, noise pollution, or like nutrition, safety, plenty of those parameters, And I think there was a very, very interesting. We have already published environmental policy and law. We already published a blog from the Yale University's that performance indicator, and I think I will suggest that maybe please take a look at that. So we'll need to revise though, and we'll need many more kind of measuring criteria to see as to how these things are translated into action at a domestic level. How the governments responded, not only what the states say, but actually what they do at the domestic level, because making a statement at the UN forum is one thing, and doing something at domestic level, through policy, legislation, and institutional structures, different governments, and you need a variety of those things which will really yield, or take it a little, human right to environment at a different level. Now let me turn to Philip Cullet. Philip, because Dr. Karan Singh mentioned about the human health, because unless the human being is healthy, the environment cannot be healthy, and Philip has beautifully provided a contributor, a chapter to our curated book, and its title is Regulation of the Planetary Health Challenges, and he has brought in the issue of antimicrobial resistance and what is called WASH, water, sanitation, hygiene, So there are very, very practical issues, and especially in the post-COVID-19 pandemic period, these issues, the human health dimension will be very, very, very important. So over to you, Philip.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you for your invitation and for sharing this platform with everyone else. Actually, I hadn't necessarily planned on speaking directly to that specific topic, so maybe I'll start with the broader remarks I had, and I'll move on to WASH at the end. The right to environment, for me, okay, there is a Stockholm start, but there is also an early 1990 start where in the UN subcommission on human rights, there is a process which is started, which seems to lead us very quickly to the linking of human rights and the environment. There's a lot of hope at that point. And I guess, interestingly, nothing happens for several decades, doesn't it? Not that nothing happens, but it takes several decades for something to happen. So the resolution we have at this point is very impressive in terms of making a policy statement, in particular, in terms of forcing everyone, and that is not those of us in the room, but many people who are still aware, policymakers and others, of the link between human rights and the environment. However obvious it may seem to us, that the links needs to be made, and made very strongly. Now, the right to environment is also special in terms of its international recognition, coming long after the majority of states have recognized it in various ways. Now, I would compare this with the case of the right to water, where we've had already a UN recognition since 2010. That was also not easy in a way, but as of 2022, we're in a context where, in principle, the right is well recognized, okay, in the same way through UN General Assembly resolution, so not in binding form. And at the national level, we still have relatively few states that have recognized it. So there's clearly interesting things happening, and water and the environment are very much linked in certain ways, and there's also links in terms of the kind of resistance that we can see to its recognition, but clearly it plays out in different ways. Now, in terms of the resolution that we have here, the recognition that we have acknowledges quite a number of challenges. So I'll just pick up on a couple of them to highlight the kind of things that may explain why is it that there are difficulties, and the difficulties will remain in terms of moving forward. The first is the recognition that there is a need for cooperation among countries, particularly developed and developing countries, but that's a broader framing, which is a sign that the traditional framing of human rights is insufficient in terms of the right to environment. That's nothing new, that's not particularly controversial. The debate on extraterritorial obligations of states in terms of human rights have progressed quite a lot over the past 1-2 decades. But still, we are in a context where we are at the cusp of the formal recognition, let's say, if it moves to binding recognition. And we are doing that through a framing which is probably not anymore suitable to the kind of challenges that we are facing. And that I don't need to repeat that. Obviously, the environmental challenges cannot be reduced. Most of them cannot be reduced to individual states. Second thing, the resolution recognizes inequality as a challenge to the realization of the rights. So in a way, telling us that there is a need for some form of affirmative action. Interestingly, it does that both at the level of individuals, so recognizing that there are inequalities which affect the realization of the right for different individuals, and at the level of states, indirectly referring to differential treatment or common but differentiated responsibilities among states. Now, what this confirms is that the universal framing of human rights is not in question, but also we need more than that. And that's also not specific to the environment, but it's probably more so with regard to the environment. Then there is the slightly more difficult issue of the link between the right to environment and sustainable development. Now, as far as I can see, that's a big challenge for the right, in the sense that it's increasingly widely recognized, understood, whichever formulation we want to use, that economic development itself is one of the main causes of the non-realization of the right to environment. So in that sense, the very framing of the right in terms of sustainable development, which relates to, in a way, what Jonas was talking before about the SDGs and the framing, in a framing which is non-human rights specific, is something that will likely make everyone's life, policymakers and people who will try to implement the right very difficult in the future. But this confirms also that there is probably a need to move ahead of the framing that we have, sustainable development is not anymore what can take us forward in terms of effectively realizing something called the right to environment, which is now recognized at the international level. We really need to be able to move a step ahead. Now, as far as I can see, the recognition of the right to environment in terms of UN General Assembly resolution is just a great step forward, but only one step forward, which will need to move further ahead, because some debates have already moved ahead of what we have here. The first is that the discourse on human rights and the environment is already ahead of the recognition that we have here. That's also nothing new to say. Already in the 1980s, there was a debate around solidarity rights, which was in effect recognizing what is indirectly framed here in terms of the need for cooperation and solidarity between states. In other words, the fact that you cannot effectively frame something like the right to environment. It's not the only right, but it's one of the main ones at the national level in the same way that traditional human rights have been framed, which is also one of the reasons why it's been so difficult to link human rights and the environment in a certain way, because there's been different perspectives. Some of the environmental people have been much more looking at the global and international dimensions and not knowing how to integrate the human rights aspect. Second is that it's increasingly widely recognized that the framing of international human rights as individual rights is not sufficient given the subject matters that we're looking at. At the national level, there are many countries where certain forms of community, collective rights have been recognized and are being strengthened. At international level, that's been much more difficult to accept or to take forward as an agenda. And that's something which also means that the right is not necessarily the right as it is being developed and recognized, is not necessarily effectively addressing the kind of challenges that arise. Thirdly, and probably more difficult and a broader issue, there is an increasing recognition that human rights with their inbuilt anthropocentricity may not be the best framing for taking the protection of the environment forward in terms of its human and social dimension. Now, here, thankfully, in a way, because we're not starting from scratch, the debate on the rights of nature have been moving quite fast over the past 10, 15 years. And that should provide us a way to think ahead of where we are today. Now, I know that there may be different understandings of rights of nature, but as far as I understand them in terms of the ways they've been implemented, mostly in different parts of the world, these are rights which help us foreground conservation. So that's also what we're trying to do with the right to environment. But at the same time, there is no opposition between environmental protection and human needs, livelihoods, whichever element it may be, because in practice, the recognition as it has taken place in the countries that have taken these frameworks ahead, not all of them, but in at least a number of countries, and both so-called developed and developing countries, have been framed around largely indigenous understandings of the environment, namely a framing that puts the environment first, but that also accounts for the livelihoods of the people who need to use them. So it's in a way a reframing of sustainable development in a new way, but also a way to allow us to rethink the way in which we understand the environment from a rights perspective. Since I've run out of time, I'll stop here. Thank you for inviting me. Thank you.
Thank you, Philip, for bringing some more dimensions to this discourse. And I think, yeah, Philip has very, raised this very, I would say, a practical, theoretical question. Whether the human rights angle or human rights dimension will be adequate enough to measure, the performance on the environmental front itself is concerned, because there is still, as you say, a lot of developments are taking place, rights of nature, rights of inanimate objects and other things, again, since we have already been speaking about anthropocentric view, for instance, whether that point of view, whether keeping the human being at the center and measuring the environmental, that raises a very, very interesting theoretical kind of a question. And the issue of inequality, which again Shailesh Naik had referred to, I think again transposition or giving effect to the realization or that kind of operationalization of the human right will also vary because of the wide range of those inequalities which exist in different society. Income, the huge disparity of income and wealth, and those graphic, if you see the figures, they're spine chilling. Huge amount of malnutrition, hunger, extreme poverty, those things. So we are talking in terms of those with 7.995 billion global population. If you see the figure, I saw the figure. I think something at least World Food Program has been saying some 800 million people, who do not have access to adequate food, for instance, even 1.2 to 1 billion people, for instance. And the things have increased in the aftermath of this Russia special military operation in Ukraine, where the hunger has been used as one of the instrument of warfare, for instance. So we have been seeing how it hits the most vulnerable people. So the whole dimension of vulnerability will need to, I think, what Juncker has been speaking about from a climate. So where it hits the most, whom does it hit the most? Who are the most vulnerable people whose human right will be at stake? And so I think those criteria will be very important to measure as we proceed further, probably in a post webinar period. And I think probably these are the issues which we'll try to take them forward. Now let me turn to Victoria Lishet. I think she's waiting patiently since we have a very long panel, and Victoria, she's the executive director of the Global Pact for the Environment Coalition, the French government, which for last at least 3 to 4 years has been campaigning for having that explicit recognition of the Global Pact for the Environment, and plenty of people, including many of the panelists, have been part of that exercise. And you saw that ultimately the UNEP at 50, the General Assembly had agreed, to only go for a political declaration, not to, Global Pact for this. So the whole idea of that Global Pact in various forms has been persisting, and we'll see how, Victoria, your take is on this issue. Over to you.
Thank you, Bharat, and thank you to the organizers of this webinar, specifically you, Bharat, and Martin, and all of the previous speakers. This is such an interesting webinar, and it's a pleasure to be here today and talk about the UN resolution on the right to a healthy environment. As many have said before me, this is a historic victory. The UN Human Rights Council had also recognized this right in a resolution in October of 2021, but the council is only composed of 47 members. And for the UN General Assembly resolution, 161 countries voted in favor, which is huge. And more than 100 of these countries also co-sponsored the resolution, which is also huge. And some countries like the US even surprised us when they voted in favor, when we thought that they might actually abstain from voting. And the US Department of State even published an article on its website stating that the US is proud to join with the international community in strongly supporting this resolution. So this, of course, gives us hope. While the resolution of the UN General Assembly are not legally binding, the strong support from all of these countries sent a powerful and symbolic message. So what's the difference between the UNGA resolution and the right as recognized since the Stockholm Declaration? One of the reasons why environmental protection was never fully enforced at the international level is actually because it has always been written as a non-legally binding obligation on states, while the UNGA resolution, which is also non-legally binding, has recognized the right to a healthy environment as a human right. So it's now part of human rights law. And that's one of the main differences. That's why we can hope that this is sort of only the beginning. And now we must just look for ways to fully implement this right. Momentum behind the right to a healthy environment may, or if you allow me to be fully optimistic, will build up speed for the recognition of the rights in a legally binding international text. It's imperative that we use this momentum and that we act now. As many of you, I guess, I believe that we need the law to better protect the planet because legal norms are at the heart of society. The law establishes a framework, it protects our rights, it imposes duties and obligations. And especially for the environment, law is useful for one essential reason. We absolutely need to change our behavior, but we are not doing anything. We know the seriousness of the triple planetary crisis. We know what could be done to reduce global warming, but we don't do anything. And the reason is rather simple. Behavior change is very difficult. Even for us who are all dedicated to change, it is difficult. So we need duties, we need obligations, and states also need to respect our rights. So we need rules. And to be more specific, we need international law, not only domestic law, because the triple planetary crisis do not know boundaries. And I'm really optimistic that thanks to this human rights resolution, and also because of all of the climate change disasters that are happening, and this summer clearly showed us that climate change impacts everyone, everywhere. Our governments will have no choice but to adopt a convention on environmental rights. And this resolution could be the foundation for this more comprehensive international instruments. And we have ambitious models that could be used for these future negotiations, including the Global Pact for the Environment and the draft covenant for the IUCN, for example. The Global Pact for the Environment is a draft environmental treaty that was drafted by more than 100 eminent jurists from all over the world in 2017. It's a very simple treaty with 26 rather short articles. And the aim of the Global Pact is to globally recognize the founding principles and rights of international environmental law. So for example, it would recognize rights and duties such as the right to a healthy environment, the duty to take care of the environment, but also the right to information, participation, and justice in environmental matters, or the principle of non-regression, for example. So like a constitution for a country, or like the covenants of 1966 on human rights, this text would be the foundation for the development of international environmental law. And as you know, the path from soft law, here that would be the non-binding UN General Assembly resolution, to hard law, here a convention on the right to a healthy environment, no matter how it will end up being called Global Pact for the Environment or not, is actually very common in international law. And the most illustrative example is the Universal Declaration of Human Rights of 1948, which is actually a part of the UN resolution on the International Bill of Human Rights, so not legally binding either, and which resulted in two treaties adopted in 1966, the famous International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and the one on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. So between 1948 and 1966, it took 18 years to incorporate the declaration into two legally binding texts. And we're really hoping that it will not take 18 years for a convention on environmental rights to be adopted after this resolution, because that would bring us to 2040, and we do not have time. The time is now, and the time has come to adopt such a convention, a third pact, a third covenant, recognizing a third generation of human rights. After our civil and political rights and our economic, social, and cultural rights, we would recognize our environmental rights. And I would like to add that civil society was really strong at the UN General Assembly for this resolution. Thanks to you, Bharat, we were even able to reach to the Ministry of Environment in India. So once again, I'm optimistic that with the help of civil society again, we will be able to reach an international agreement on environmental rights. It's essential for us and for the planet. Thank you very much for the opportunity, Bharat and Martin.
Thank you, Victoria, for flagging this issue. I think two important part. One is, of course, the question of changing the behavior, and this is one of the most difficult tasks, which humankind has been really stuck. How does make a dent on the human mind? We have not succeeded. In fact, if one sees the very alarm bells raised, by the United Nations Secretary General in his address to the Stockholm 50 conference, saying that please bring us out of this mess, please save us, and we have failed and faltered in our environmental performance card. The executive director of UNEP saying that if Indira Gandhi and Olof Palme were here, and if they would ask us the question, that what did you do, that what answer would we provide to them, that spoke volumes about the entire 50 years of trajectory, that did it bring about that sea change or the kind of that really the change in the human mindset, that did we take it seriously, notwithstanding everything, that the moral halo which was witnessed in 1970 Stockholm Conference, 2022 Stockholm Conference, probably none of the heads of state or heads of government came forward, to just say that yes, we will really take it seriously. So mindset will be a very, very big challenge, as we really move forward. But I think probably yes, we need to stay the course and to tame the beast, so to say. I think see that what goes on. And finally, I think you mentioned about the whole issue of the treaty-based right. For instance, can we convert this from a soft instrument into a treaty? Maybe can it lead to a kind of a third international covenant on human right to environment? I think that will remain to be seen. But the question is, as long as the sovereign states do the deliver, I think that will be very important, because most of the sovereign states, they want the political convenience. They don't want a treaty-based, kind of obligation to. But probably with the winds of change, I think maybe the time will say if they are ready to go for the kind of third covenant, to have an international, covenant on human right to environment protection. I think the time will provide us the answer. Now, finally, let me come to the, to Victor Trafour. I think probably, he's already here now. And Victor, over to you. The final comments. You need to unmute. Yeah.
Well, first of all, thank you, Bharat, Martin, and all colleagues for actually leaving a little bit of room, or at least something for me to say. I think that was going to be my challenge. I saw it when I got the program, but of course, there's also some benefits that you can try to add something to this wonderful conversation, and I think it will build on many of your prior statements and analysis. But just following on Victoria is going to be very timely, because that's where probably I have something more to offer, precisely on that vision of civil society, as I've been doing that in the last 5 years as the Associate Executive Governor of ISIL that Professor Robinson has led. And it's been that 5 years of the revamping of ISIL, and it precisely started when the Global Pact initiative was presented at Columbia University exactly 5 years ago. So ISIL has been following this at the General Assembly, and has been following the path also as it went along to Nairobi and came back. So I'll give some remarks on that line. Secondly, that's my part-time academic hat. I run the practicum that takes students to the UN to work in missions for Pace University. So I've been following what the students do. They can't tell me all the things they do for their missions, but it is fantastic to see them engage. And I think there's more of that connection. And last, I'll say a few things about the Escazú topic. That's wearing not my other hat, but my roots. I'm Colombian from origin, and I've been following the debate in the last 4 years. Actually, 4 years ago, it opened up for signature here in New York, but the government has gone back and forth. But with the new government taking office this year, it's clear that it will probably going to move forward. It already passed the Senate, and it's going to the House. It's been debated and probably will be in front of, there'll be a law and in front of the new Colombian president to sign. So I'll give you a few remarks on those lines. First, I do think it is monumental what has happened from a procedural perspective. I think you've all been focusing on substantive and history. If focusing on the moment to take this to the General Assembly, and from a negotiations perspective, diplomacy, it's just monumental and incredible that this has happened. But of course, it was 50 years after many, many other presidents. So finally, it has happened here, but it's still always incredible to see those resolutions being adopted and passed. And this one, as you've already analyzed, has this recognition. And in the operative paragraph 2, it does mention other rights and existing international law. So it just gives that opportunity to build in. And in OP3, the operative paragraph, it does relate to the multilateral environmental agreements and other principles of international law. So the resolution does kind of, I think, invite the future development of environmental law, and the connections, which I think is vital. But there's something that you may have not noticed in the preambular paragraphs of the resolution, is that this path, there's two paths that has led us here. One path is as I will call it, the human rights path. The Human Rights Council work and all the previous work that relates to that goes a decade back and many years, but that's where it took kind of the big win behind it. But the other track, of course, is the sustainability environmental law track, which if you look at the 20 preamble paragraphs of the resolution, the human rights track is clearly in there. All is there. There's reference to the Human Rights Council resolution, the work behind it, even the guiding principles on business and human rights, etc. And there is, of course, reference to Rio +20. There's reference to, of course, the 2030 agenda, resolution 70/1, but there's no reference to resolution 73/333. There's no reference to the political declaration that came out of Nairobi, right? I think that it was probably a way to make this pass, the history. But it's also interesting that it was not clearly mentioned, because as Victoria was pointing out, it does connect. It does connect. It was actually the text that the political declaration in Nairobi for the 50th anniversary had the possibility of adopting it, and they passed on it. They declined. They just cross-referenced to the Human Rights Council. It could have been another monumental approach, but it just didn't happen. They just had to let it go, because it was probably not the right fora, it was not the right moment. But now that we all have everything in perspective, I think this reflection I'm making is probably helping us identify what some of the reasons and difficulties that we'll see coming forward, and probably would need to be covered before we move into the next phase. That could be that covenant that we've been talking about. I think so. Let's if we stick to that for a minute. It is important because it's 5 years. If you follow the preamble paragraphs, then it kind of jumps from Rio +20. It does talk about climate change without any reference to documents. It does talk about biodiversity laws, but it kind of skips that piece of this 5 years of the Global Pact initiative and all the related instruments that were discussed, the report from the Secretary General on that topic, which was instrumental. So a couple of notes on that. After it was presented here in New York, President Macron, of course, laid it out at the General Assembly. And a few months later, Resolution 72/277 was passed. And that process took to Nairobi, and it was a combination of all the issues of the implementation of international environmental law. I think that process was necessary. It was exhausting. It was difficult. It was frustrating at times, but I think that was necessary for the countries to ventilate that issue, that it was probably not in the room of what does it really mean to have the recognition of the right to a healthy environment, and what does it mean to have more work or clarification of the principles of international environmental law. So as difficult as it was, I think it was, and of course it's a work in progress. Probably it's not the end, and the end was not that it can't happen. It's kind of a recognition, it's important, but it's still, it requires further work. Further work meaning what? Meaning national decisions, national jurisprudence, work from the MEAs, work at all levels, precisely. So some development, I think, will help clarify all these, all the pieces. Resolution, there are some important background there. For example, Resolution 73/333 had some very important substantive recommendations, but it also had some guiding principles, 5 guiding principles that would be those necessary to follow the actual substantive recommendations, and that those included the future generations, the connection with sustainability. So those some overlooked background documents will be helpful, as I think, as we implement this new phase, because as I say, it's clear, or at least from the human rights track, things already have a lot of dynamic, right? We have implementation at various levels, we have follow-up, then how you do that on the environment sustainability piece is central. So that, I think those principles are important to be considered. And the work, of course, culminated in the political declaration in Nairobi, the 2020. That political declaration also is valuable because it provides some context. It did pass on recognizing the right to a healthy environment, but all the other pieces are there. So I think what my main comment is, this has to be all seen in context, right?
Victor, 1 more minute.
Yes, so the Resolution 73/333, the Stockholm Declaration, the Human Rights Council, and regarding Escazú, I think the countries would need to see a little more clarity, and it will happen in order to then implement it. It's important to see those difficulties that they are encountering to understand what does it really mean. So I think if there's a little more work there, all other Latin American countries will flock in, and then the implementation of Escazú can take flight. Thank you for this last opportunity.
Thank you, Victor, for mentioning what we started with, what Nick mentioned as the operationalization part, and Victor mentioning about those practical, kind of the issues about, we could see there are human sensitivities, there are sensitivities on the part of the states also, about those processes and structural aspects, there are gaping holes in this, you can see, what happens, for instance, both the events, UNEP, 50 years of UNEP in March, only 2 days event. The Stockholm Plus 50 event, only 2 days event, and you could see both, bringing in, the enabling and the modalities resolution explicitly made clear that Kenya shall join the host country, Sweden, for instance. So there are some things probably that can rob off an event, about something which could have been normally be possible, for instance. But I think that is exactly what the whole political process is about, that there is a tug of war, there are those, but still this could be doable, like what the Secretary General said only yesterday, saying that, well, silent diplomacy will work more efficiently than the loudspeaker diplomacy, and these are very sensitive issues where you need to bring the countries on board, blunt the edges, make them, because there are practical considerations also. And I think probably how the UN process will unfold, as the Secretary General has already commenced the process. There is already the General Assembly resolution, which has set the stage for having the summit of the future on 22nd to 23rd of September 2024. 2 years down the line, there could be a Secretary General Special Envoy on future generation, a series of those initiatives which have been put into place. So there is a long way to cover. I think we know that as the scenario will move to the UN headquarters, and probably, Victor, that I think the task is cut out for you, to, as an IUCN's representative to United Nations, maybe you and I think Nick, you'll need to little give the thought, as to put in place something which can, reach out, educate, and maybe sensitize the member states, those which were, like you saw, how some of the states which would abstain in the Human Rights Council resolution, like India, abstain. And for the General Assembly resolution, India did vote in favor of the resolution. So these are the things, these are doable, possible, only if you can take care of the sensitivities. So I'll just stop here, and then maybe we have time is running out, and we have 2 questions waiting for us. I thought we'll just throw the floor open, and maybe the panelists can respond to these questions. One is, of course, I think for Kirk Junker, about the operationalizing the human right to clean environment. If you can see in the chat box, one is that question, and the second is about the governmental organizations set as a cumulative and effective measure to ensure the standard of healthy environment and life in particular. The floor is open, and I request all the panelists, anyone who can really respond to these questions. The 2 questions are there in the chat box. If you can kindly click on that. First, maybe Kirk, you can take a call. The first question by Laura Malikova.
Okay, sorry, just a second here. I was
Just
looking
for
in
the first
question
part in
and
the chat.
answer. Yes, I was looking at question and answer, not in chat.
Okay.
And I'm not seeing anything in chat, and I don't know why.
Okay. Let me read. Yeah, it said absolutely.
If you can just tell me again.
It is in the question and answer box, not in the chat. It's in the Q&A.
Right, okay.
Question and answer box. Yeah.
All right. Okay. So this was a comment that Laura had made earlier today. I see it as a comment. I don't have much more to say about it other than what I answered when she made it initially. That if the citizens groups are the actors in the litigation that I was advocating, it does, of course, only benefit those particular citizens groups. But I think this shows quick action, and there can be the sort of soft response from the litigation that would occur that we would expect if it were political otherwise. So it still is why I would advocate that. Yeah, that's all I'll say on that. Thanks.
Yeah, and the second question, can one of the panelists will respond to it? Maybe Philippe. Maybe this talks about the standard of healthy environment and life in particular. Philippe?
Sorry, could you repeat? I just had to go and open the door.
Yeah, it says that simple question as to why can't, in general, the governmental organizations set a cumulative and effective measures to ensure the standard of healthy environment and the life in particular?
Hey, that's a very difficult question.
Yeah.
And especially to answer in 1 minute. I'm sure they can, but there are 2 different things. One is that the framing of rights is generally done at the generic level so that there is scope for them to grow over time, so that they can adapt to the changing circumstances over time. And the second is obviously given the level of, controversy, I don't know where I want to say controversy, but the level of disagreement that there can be on the specificities that makes it much more difficult to move forward. But I suppose, and that maybe Jonas would be better placed to answer in that sense, the Aarhus Convention in that sense shows that when you take specific elements, you can actually move forward quite effectively.
Yeah. And there is one more last question, probably, I think. How do we ensure that the institutions which are meant to implement environmental laws are effective and efficient? Maybe, Nick, you can take a call.
Well, I think what Jonas has said about accountability in Aarhus, and Richard McCrory has said about the new office in the United Kingdom, and Kirk has said about the role of the courts in litigation is perhaps the answer. If there's to be a new international agreement, it can't be just another covenant restating principles as hard law. We've learned that you have to have implementation mechanisms. You have to have procedures for the realization of rights. And these procedures have been pioneered. We have them. So the first question, can't we have an Aarhus Center in every country? Well, of course, and Escazú may get us that throughout South America. But we need to create those accountability mechanisms and give access to them. So I think it's very exciting what's happening with Richard and his new office. We have a lot of work to do there.
I think, could I just, I'd comment on that as well, and maybe Jonas would like to say something about how the Aarhus Committee works and so on, is that it's a very odd body that we've set up. You know, as I said, it's independent. It has powers to take government to court. But really, we want to make government, and I include local authorities and all public bodies, you know, act better. So in a sense, our role is to annoy government, because we're bound to annoy government at times, but not to completely antagonize it. You know, there's no point if you're just completely antagonistic, you won't get anywhere. And that's going to be, you know, we're going to learn how you do that. And we've quite often at the moment, we tend to have our present government, you know, has laid down some very ambitious environmental goals and plans, but we're not convinced they know how to get there. So our tone often in response is to say, we welcome what the government has said. It wants to, you know, get biodiversity targets up, but how are they going to get there, and then go into detail. So I think these, if you like, audit bodies, which I think are very, very important part of the picture, getting the tone right, and Aarhus must have the same thing. You're dealing, you know, you get complaints, you investigate, and then you've got to deal with the countries concerned. And how do you do it, you know?
Any other panelists wants to comment upon it or say anything?
Jonas is.
I can say a few words, Bert, on that. Just to follow up on Philip's and Richard's point. I think it is essential in international law, following up on that there is some kind of review mechanism. You can call it an accountability mechanism of some sort, but we see in the human rights treaties with the courts, but the compliance mechanism was not a court, and it was not, I think the term that Richard used was very good. I think I recognize that very much. I think we annoyed, but we did not antagonize governments when we were checking compliance. It was set up as a constructive way, and I think we have achieved that quite well. It's a constructive way to examine whether states comply, and if the committee concludes that they don't comply, there is a related follow-up mechanism, and we have seen some good result with that. Even with the European Union, after some delay, they took measures to get in compliance with what the committee did. And it is important to have this mechanism so that states don't get away with self-serving interpretation, that they have done what they should, etc., etc. And the tricky thing was, of course, to keep the integrity of the committee. Although it was not a court, I think we used quite a few of the elements that you find in court with due process, integrity. We had strict rules of conflict of interest. If such bodies can be set up nationally, well, that sounds very fascinating. I don't know whether the Philippines Human Rights Commission has something of to that effect also, as Richard mentioned. But we could see, of course, that some governments were quite upset about that. In particular, just a recent case, just to mention, we had a case, the compliance committee had found Belarus not to comply, and also with this provision about not harassing members of the public. And Belarus did not make so much fuss about that conclusion, but then just before the last meeting of the parties last year, I was informed a few weeks that Belarus, and this I think was part of Lukashenko's general aggression against civil society organization, they have moved on to liquidate the environmental organizations that have brought the cases to the compliance committee, which, well, honestly make me quite upset leading the compliance committee. And the compliance committee drafted a new report to the meeting of the parties, suggesting that the meeting of the parties decide on the strongest mechanism, which was that, namely to suspend the privileges and rights under the convention, not the voting right, they are in the treaty, but other things of a formal and a bit prestigious character. Now, that we checked with the NGOs in Belarus what they thought about this, because we knew that there was a possibility that Belarus would go the way which is now how unfortunately does, namely to leave the convention, which was of course very unfortunate. But there was a certain red line, I think, to draw here, that you could not simply accept that without reacting strongly. But I think, again, in most cases, there have been very constructive ways to work with governments. And that's the way I understood it with the body in the UK also, that it's intended to be annoying, but not antagonistic. And I think that captures very much. I think that is a fruitful way to conclude that now someone is failing to comply, but then work together to better situation.
Yeah, I think that issue of compliance is again a different under the most of the multilateral environment regulation, soft, persuasive methods, not to antagonize the governments and to bring them on board to ensure the performance. I think maybe we can take that forward, in the subsequent to our webinar, So
just add a short point to that. Also, Victor was mentioning the SKSU agreement, and I was only 2 weeks ago or so in a meeting with the bureau or the officers of that convention and the secretariat in Santiago. They are also setting up a rather similar body, and I hope that it will develop and work also in such a constructive way that we have seen in the European region. So I really wish you the best of luck in Latin America on developing that review body.
Thank you. Yeah, we have almost overshot 2 hour time, and I thank each of the panelists for this such a wonderful, very constructive, and I think that contribution, the additional contribution. And I think we look forward to follow up on this webinar. As I said, we'll plan to have a special issue of the environmental policy and law in the year volume 53 at issue number 2 and 3. And I already sent out invitation to some of the colleagues, and we'll do for others, and all of you are invited to contribute, I think once our invitation comes in. So I'll just stop here. Thank each of them: Richard McCrory, Carl Juncker, Nick Robinson, Philip Cullet, and all others, and Victoria, Owen McIntyre, Victor Tafur, Jonas Abison, Dr. Karan Singh, and Dr. Shailesh Nayak, who already by now left. So over to you, Martin.
Thank you, Bharat, and thank to you all. It was a great session. It was a long session. Just like to take a moment to thank our co-sponsoring organization, the Global Pact for the Environment, the International Union for Conservation of Nature, the International Council of Environmental Law, the Olaf Palme International Center, and also the Jawaharlal University. And above all, thanks to you. It was a great session. We look forward to a fantastic special issue. It's all in your and Bharat's hands. We very much look forward to that, and we appreciate to facilitate that as the Journal of Environmental Policy and Law. And with that said, I wish you a best remainder of the day.